Our symposium this morning is looking at technology for ADHD measurement, diagnosis, and treatment in young populations, so infants through adolescents. We're really excited to talk about some of the recent and ongoing work that's being done in our labs with you. This symposium was really spearheaded by Jihui Diaz, and I'm just riding her coattails here, but I'll start off with a bit of an overview of ADHD just to get us all on the same page. Thanks so much for closing that. And then we'll roll right into the talks. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is highly prevalent. The most recent population estimates have it at about 1 in 9 kids having been diagnosed. And those rates have been increasing over the years. And there are these two main symptom domains of inattention. So these are symptoms like distractibility, a hard time focusing, difficulty with organization, forgetfulness, as well as hyperactivity and impulsivity. So when you think about kind of a kid running around the classroom or being very fidgety, kind of very active, as well as kind of jumping in and interrupting. So we have these two symptom domains, and together in ADHD, these symptoms can cause quite a bit of impairment, although there's certainly a spectrum of severity. But impairing areas like academic functioning, so even though a child is very bright and smart, these difficulties attending can impair their academic performance, social relationships, certainly family dynamics at home, etc. Now, ADHD is typically diagnosed when kids start to get into school. So although we think of it as a neurodevelopmental disorder starting extremely early in life, probably at birth, we haven't been able too much to sort of like detect it or be sure about it until a child gets into an environment where they are expected to attend and they are expected to sit for longer periods of time and to be able to sort of compare those behaviors to other kids their age. And so we'll sort of get into a little bit of that with one of our talks today. We also know that measurement of these symptoms tends to rely on self-reports or other reporters, and that can be pretty subjective and depend on an individual's gauge for what's normal or not, and can be pretty burdensome depending on the assessment process. And just a little bit of information briefly on treatment. Stimulant medications are the first-line treatment for ADHD, but certainly that doesn't necessarily work for everybody, or necessarily it would be the preference for all families. And as kids get older, we know that that medication use declines for various reasons, and so we see an increased preference for psychosocial treatments like therapy and school supports. However, we know that, as one of our speakers will talk about today, engagement by adolescents in many things, less alone, treatment for ADHD can be difficult. So thinking about how to get those teens at that age best supported for their ADHD. So we're thinking today in this symposium about how we might leverage technology in ADHD to sort of start to get at some of these issues I've brought up. So I will start us off by talking about how can we leverage technology to measure ADHD more objectively and with less burden. And then Dr. Jihui Diaz will discuss early findings for diagnosing ADHD much earlier, even in infancy. And finally, Dr. Melissa Dvorsky will discuss an app that is designed to help engage youth with ADHD more effectively in treatment that is designed to help them, particularly with organizational skills. I apologize, but our fourth speaker unfortunately was unable to make it due to a family emergency, but I did want to, if you put her information up here, Dr. Dara Babinski. She is welcomes emails if you're particularly interested in her work. So I do apologize about that. But this does leave us with plenty of time for questions and discussion. We will go through each of the 3 talks and then have plenty of time at the end for questions and discussion. Of course, if there's like a burning question about a talk at the end of it, feel free to let us know and we can address it then. Right, so I'm Traci Kennedy, assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh Department of Psychiatry. I am a clinical psychologist, so that's how I'm approaching this talk and this work, just FYI. And I'll be discussing some work by our team on a smartwatch software program, Lemur DX, to provide objective measurement of hyperactivity using mobile sensing, machine learning, and context modeling. So, hyperactivity for young children is one of the most common presentations or behaviors that we see for ADHD. But currently, measuring hyperactivity involves parent and teacher reports, as I mentioned, which are subjective and can be burdensome, and we don't always get them back. So it can lead to, potentially inaccurate measures for hyperactivity. While we have objective measures for inattention, we don't necessarily have that same measure for hyperactivity. And our team is working on this problem by leveraging mobile sensing to help clinical researchers measure hyperactivity, sort of in response to treatment and studies, and potentially ultimately in sort of real-life clinical settings to help make decisions on whether kids' hyperactivity levels are clinically elevated and how those symptom levels change over time in response to environmental stimuli, et cetera. So researchers have used actigraphy and commodity sensors to measure children's body motion and correlate it with reports of hyperactivity. And current smartwatches that many of us wear do have motion sensors that can measure acceleration and gyro data, which are helpful to quantify movement and one's arm movement in particular. For example, Jiang et al. Proposed a wearable assessment system involving these 10 different standardized tasks within like a laboratory setting, during which the watch measures children's motion data. Not necessarily the watch, but the system. And the results suggested that there's a significant difference between the motion data of children with and without hyperactivity, meaning with and without ADHD in those younger ages. And while showing promise, this work sort of assumes these measurements of children's motion data happen during specific activities in these controlled settings and doesn't necessarily get to the messier problem of like real world settings when kids are out and about and at school and with their friends, et cetera. Which is really critical, we know, with ADHD, since determining whether hyperactivity is excessive needs to consider the context or situation according to the DSM. So for example, in the 2 symptoms we have up here, the presence of hyperactivity needs to be inappropriate for particular contexts, such as when the child is supposed to be sitting still and being quiet. But clearly running around and leaving their seat would not be considered inappropriate in situations like recess when the child is on the playground or in sports. So the context really matters there. And then the frequency and consistency of these behaviors captured by like the often in these symptom descriptions is also really important to capture real world monitoring outside of these prescribed lab settings in children's day-to-day lives. Also, a diagnosis of ADHD requires that symptoms be present in more than one context or setting, which makes the objective assessment of ADHD or hyperactivity anchored to separate settings or contexts really crucial. So we've been developing a smartwatch system for hyperactivity detection from passively sensed data from smartwatches worn by children freely in their daily lives across a range of activities and contexts to leverage existing data without additional user burden of filling out these parent and teacher report assessments. And our short-term goal with this is to offer this form of measurement to assess symptom outcomes in treatment studies of ADHD, including both medication and potentially psychosocial treatment, potentially with the ultimate goal of working this into a more clinical setting to be able to detect hyperactivity. But this is really tricky in real-world settings because these settings are uncontrolled, and it's a lot harder to know exactly what a child is supposed to be doing in a certain setting and like what context they're in purely passively. So in this study, we propose an approach to contextualize the motion data we're collecting in an unconstrained or unlabeled manner using machine learning. So for this study I'm presenting here, for our data collection, our team built the custom application, Lemur DX, that recorded accelerometer data at 50 hertz, heart rate, GPS-based location, and nearby Bluetooth devices. For this work, we primarily used motion data to build machine learning models. We have yet to utilize these other sensor data, but we're hoping to work this in as we continue to refine the model, and these data can also be potentially shown to clinical researchers as part of kind of the data dashboard that we're also working on with this. Also in the study, at the end of each day, we asked a caregiver to log the child's activity for the day in half-hour intervals, and the activity labels consisted of the 7 activities you see here. And we gave the caregivers the option to reduce their burden to do these activity labels at the end of the day. So of course this likely introduces noise to our labels, but we were looking for that optimal balance between user burden, because I, for one, am not going to be sitting there every half hour when I get pinged to write exactly where my kid is at that time. And children in our sample were between age 5 to 12 who wore the watch every day during waking hours for 1 week. And research staff screened potential participants for eligibility, and then children with any potentially interfering psychiatric disorders were excluded. So we started off with 68 participants, of whom 32 had ADHD, 36 without. And they also had to not just have a diagnosis of ADHD externally, but also meet criteria according to the case ads, a structured sort of gold standard interview. And then we did exclude 4 participants due to watch errors, and then another one participant had inadequate contextual labels, but all the others, we got full contextual label data from the parents. They did a really great job of getting those to us. So we ended up getting usable data from 61 total participants. And the individuals with ADHD were unmedicated. So these are just visualizations of sort of the movement data in different settings. And when we visualize these, we noticed there were movements when the children in the 2 groups behaved similarly. So this figure shows randomly extracted example acceleration plots of 2 children, one hyperactive with ADHD and one control, by activity context over 5 minutes. And you can see there's not much difference between the 2 groups during things like sleeping, exercise, and at school. But the child with hyperactivity shows much more movement than the child in the control group during these sitting quiet moments. And so this observation highlights the importance of making ML models aware of that activity context. This is the baseline model of our machine learning pipeline. And we first applied featurization to the raw acceleration data. Specifically, we computed 12 features such as max, min, difference between max, min, standard deviation, and so on. Then we trained ML models and compute the final prediction regarding whether the child has ADHD hyperactivity or not. Specifically, we compared multiple different ML models. I'm happy to go into more details on those if anyone's interested. And we applied a standardized process of feature selection across the models using feature importance and used leave one out cross-validation. And so in the remaining slides here, the random forest model achieved the best performance, so we report results from the random forest model moving forward. So the result of the hyperactivity detection without the use of caregiver-assigned labels was 63% F1 score, which is definitely like less than optimal accuracy, which shows this relative difficulty of building models using the passive data in a completely unconstrained manner. Then we leveraged the contextual data that was labeled by the caregivers, and here we applied context filtering. Based on this labeled contextual information, we filtered feature data for the model inputs by focusing on the times corresponding to specific activities, so particularly sitting, being quiet. And the result of the hyperactivity detection with this context filtering was an F1 score of 81.6%, obviously a significant improvement when using that contextual information. Then finally, we tried to even estimate the contextual data for a fully automated system without relying on caregivers' labels. So here we aim to develop a filter that finds moments when the difference between children with and without hyperactivity would be significant. So during these sitting, being quiet moments, or when they're supposed to be. And we used machine learning for estimating these sitting quiet moments. This approach assumes that we have these like caregiver annotated activity labels for training participants, but we don't have them for our test participants in the machine learning procedure. We trained a binary classifier that estimates whether each child was in the sitting quiet condition for each half hour when the data were collected. And then our resulting ML model achieved 78.4% F1 score, which is pretty comparable to the result when we use the parent annotated labels. Not quite hitting that 80% that we're going for, or 85, but we're getting closer. So this result suggests that even without using the parent annotated labels, the trained filter based on the ML model can help estimate the risk score for children pretty reliably. So even though it's like noisy and coarse, parent annotated labels that are still reliable can be helpful in sort of training this algorithm. And then we aimed to make the ML pipeline more interpretable for the ultimate user by converting this ultimate prediction into a risk score, a continuous risk score that's a clinical researcher or a clinician could ultimately visualize on a dashboard. And this is just really hitting home the point about these sitting quiet moments. And then I wanted to highlight this figure shows the relationship between participants' baseline Vanderbilt scores, which is like a symptom rating scale, and their risk score. And you can see that there's a slight correlation there between the output risk score and their symptoms, which implies the possibility of our model estimating the severity of hyperactivity, which would be really useful in clinical research, for example, noticing differences in response to medication or other treatments, for example. So a few limitations to point out. We didn't have children with sort of like moderate levels of symptom severity to really start to test this continuous like risk score and really get a good intermediate level. So we're looking at that now. We also had limited sociodemographic diversity, which I didn't get into here, but that's a key priority of our next work. And also hyperactivity involves more than just gross movement, and so, acknowledging the fact that there's types of hyperactivity that we're most certainly not capturing here in the system. But I just wanted to highlight the current project that we're working on now with this, which is an SBIR from NIMH. So we're working now on refining the data pipeline and the dashboard that we would show to clinical researchers. And then we'll enroll 100 children, 6 to 11, all who have ADHD. And they use medication, but take medication holidays, which is fairly common, especially times like the weekends or summers. So that what we can do is bring them into the lab on 2 separate days, one on which they're medicated, one on which they're not, have them do standardized tasks wearing the watch, and really get that excellent quality, like labeled data. So for example, having them do something sitting quietly, having them play freely, and be able to collect that data in the lab. Then we'll also send them home with the watch for a week and have them freely wear it to further try to refine our machine learning model and further validate it in this sample of kids all with ADHD. And so our goal is really to be able to classify the days when they're on versus off medication. So kind of a more granular classification problem than we've tackled to date. And then this is just a very sort of preliminary mock-up of the dashboard that we're working on with our team that would be shown to clinical researchers, and we're getting a lot of user input. So if you or anyone you know is interested in giving your input on this system, we'd love to talk to you. We're going to be doing a lot of interviews and focus groups on this piece. So just wanted to acknowledge our funders, NIMH, as well as the Pinch Challenge and all the children and families who have participated so far. Thank you so much. Yeah.
For the recordings, they can hear. This is incredible, really interesting to hear your talk. When it comes to the labels, I imagine I have a 5-year-old, right? And so I could probably tell you what he's doing a little bit better when he's home with me, in order to create those labels. But when you have the broad one of school, I imagine that introduces a lot of noise, because I don't know at school, when is he out playing? When is he, at home? Not at home. When is he sitting and reading? And I don't really know that. So I guess, but I imagine that school is a time where a lot of kids with ADHD might have strong symptoms. So I guess, how do you break that up, and how do parents know how to provide those labels?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've really gone back and forth about this, and is there anything helpful we can use to get at that more precisely in the sensor data? And this exact thing was brought up, I don't know when my kid is at recess versus supposed to be sitting quietly. So that's partly why we're doing the lab piece of this, to get the extremely good labeled data. And then that's kind of what we're testing, is to see if we can use how well it works to just automatically, using the algorithm we've developed, pick up on those moments. So hopefully we'll be able to do it without the parent labels, because that's what we would have to do in real life. So it's such a good point, yeah. All right, well, I want to introduce Dr. Jihui Diaz. She'll be presenting on her work, Looking to the Future, Visual Attention Accesses the Ontogeny of ADHD in Infancy. You can use this, too. I think really do a good job.
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Diaz. I'm an assistant professor of statistics at the University of Pittsburgh. So, as I said, I'm a statistician, and organizing this session in psychiatry is a weird combination of words. But at least I have 2 awesome clinical psychologists here in the session talking about their subject matters. At the Department of Psychiatry at Pitt, I do a lot of smartphone and wearable data analysis, including the feature engineering of longitudinal data from those devices, and also clusterings of intensive longitudinal data from those devices. Today, I will talk about a secondary data analysis from a already funded project, so we already had the data, and it was one of the things that I looked at the data and say, hey, how about we do this? So it may be one, not as interesting in terms of the study design, because I didn't really get to do the things that I wanted to do. And two, it's already relatively cleaned with the streamlined pre-processing steps. So we may not have so much of a tech savvy stuff, but definitely something that I think we could benefit from the statistical methodologies that I applied here. Specifically, what we're focusing on today is visual attention of infants. So they're looking at certain objects and show us that they're focusing on it, and therefore they're learning something about that object. So before they get to express themselves verbally or non-verbally, they show their attention like so, and that concept is called habituation that we're going to focus on today. That is a decreasing pattern of their visual responding to certain exposure because they looked at it so many times, or the exposure is given to them repeatedly. So I was thinking when I was having my infant, she's looking at this object for 2 seconds and just look away. And I thought that may be the sign of ADHD. But surprisingly, habituation, meaning realizing that they learn everything that they need to learn from the object and move on to the next one, is a very great indicator of their learning ability. So that's related to the concept called neural adaptation, where the neural activity decreases as well as the stimulation is repeated. So this is one of the commonly used tools to study cognitive abilities of kids, because they cannot tell you, or we cannot tell the difference between them being fidgety or they move on to the next stimulus that they're interested in. And what surprised me the most is the second bullet point, where it is an indicator of the length of looking is an indicator of their better attention. Surprisingly, short looking is a great indicator of their more efficient learning, because they get the compact information really promptly. So there's my baby looking at a book. I think she's focusing, provided that her one sock is missing. But how long are they looking at that early age can say a lot about their later life outcome. Dr. Kennedy talked about their intelligence, or their performing in the standardized test scores in the later childhood, and executive functioning and cognitive processing efficiency as well. So if we can find indicators of their ADHD development as early as infancy, it would be interesting if we can chime in and think of an intervention for them, and therefore manage their symptoms better, and they would perform better in school or in life in general. But there are not many objective tasks that are examining the potential early markers of ADHD, and this is potentially one of the twists that we gave in the area of infant ADHD studies. By looking into this data set called from the Paris study. It's Pittsburgh ADHD Risk in Infancy study. We have a little shy after the data cleaning of 120 infant and parent pairs. So what we have is to collect data from infant and also data from parents, because there are a lot of factors that we can learn from the parents that they're genetically inheriting, things like ADHD. So familiar risk for ADHD is coded as a binary outcome variable, where they're at a high risk if at least one parent meet the criteria for ADHD according to the DSM-5 items. And if not, it's low risk. We have some exclusion criteria, as you see there. So as long as they're born after 75 weeks and have decent weight and everything, they can be included to the study. So here's the demographics of our participants. As I said, we have around 120 infants, and their median age mean age here is around 9 months old, and their gender is relatively evenly distributed, and as you notice here, the race is dominantly white. That's a Pittsburgh thing, and we really have to work on that, but that's what you see there. Majority of them are not Hispanic or Latino and have decent education from four-year college or graduate degree for either of the parents in the sample. So we have two habituation tasks. Here, I try to fit in the digital study because we're using video recordings to test their habituation because it's kind of hard for us to say, hey, work your smartphone, infant, or wear your wearables, infant. So we have two different tests of one unimodal. There's only one type of information given to them. And multimodal, that's two different types of sensory information that they are exposed to. So I'm going to show you how that's working here. It's starting with the Winnie the Pooh grabbing their attention. I actually cut this video so you don't really see the people behind the scene. So in the back, we have a coder. I'm going to talk about that person in a little bit. And there's a baby sitting in front of the screen, and most of the time, the caregiver, mostly mother, will be holding them so they don't really get scared of the environment there. So Winnie the Pooh says, hey, baby, look at me. And unimodal stimulus happens like this.
Look, it's Winnie the Pooh. Good baby.
Good baby, it says. And then one type of sensory stimulus is happening. There's that straight lines, and see if they're looking at that screen long enough. How long and how fast do they look away, and how long they're looking away. So we're exposing them with this stimulus for 20 seconds per trial, and they're doing it for 20 times, so 20 trials total, up to 20 trials total. And either they look at that screen for 20 seconds straight, that's a completion of a trial, or they habituate if they look away from the screen more than 2 seconds. Multimodal has both visual and auditory exposure.
Look, it's Winnie the Pooh. Good baby.
Good baby. And there is there's a noise, beeping noise, and then the screen. So it's kind of a combination of the both. It's harder to separate the auditory stimulus from the visual, so we call that multimodal. And as I said, there's a coder in the back. They're live coding what's happening here. So once the baby looks at the screen, that's when we start. And then they look away, and then we would count the seconds that they look away. And if it exceeds 2 seconds, they did the whole trial completes and they habituated. If not, they go into the next trial up to 20 and see if they habituate or not. So there are two portions of these tests. One is experimental and the other is test. The experimental is up to 20 trials, as I described before, 20 seconds per trial, and we observe how many trials that they had to go through before habituation in total. And the second one is the duration of each trial. So what happens is that, it's the same thing for adults as well. They may have to figure things out a little longer in the beginning, but then as they get to learn and they expect things that are going to come to the screen, and therefore their response time gets shorter. So as you will see later on, for the longitudinal trend of that, it would go down. The look time would go down over the trials before they reach to the habituation. So up to 20 trials, we do the experimental portion of the exact same screen or the sound that they're looking at. And the test portion is to see if they retain this concept that they learn. So it's up to 5 trials. The first 3 trials are slightly different, so you see the curves there instead of the straight lines for the unimodal task, and the multimodal has slightly different sound there. And to see the same thing of the response time, if they actually catch onto this newer concept and stay habituated or achieve the habituation faster enough, that's one thing that we would like to observe from the second portion of the task. So what we did with this when they showed me, it was kind of an underusage of the data because they only used how long did it take. After 10 trials, they habituated, and that's it. But I think that the trajectory of habituation actually means something. So what I suggested is to identify subtype of habituation over time using growth mixture models. It is known by many other names as latent class linear mixed models or heterogeneous linear mixed models or any other names that you heard of. They're probably talking about the same thing. They are the multi-level analysis methods that identify unique distinctive trajectories over time. So it's kind of a clustering algorithm, but on a longitudinal data. And once we obtain the subtypes, we actually fitted the logistic regression model where the outcome variable is high versus low risk of the ADHD defined using the familiar ADHD information. So here are two clusters that we identified from one unimodal and the other one multimodal task data. X-axis is a trial. So as you see, it's going from 1 to 20, counting for 20 total trials. Y-axis is a looking time of each trial. We talked about up to 20 seconds they may look at the stimulus, and then if they look away for two seconds or more, then that's the end of the trial. So for unimodal, that's the straight line up there. We have three classes or subtypes. The first class in the bottom here is the short lookers. So they start early on. They don't really look long at the stimulus, and they actually tend to habituate faster. And we're going to see that in the form of binary variable, habituated yes or no. The green dash lines here up top is they're still short lookers because as you see early on, they only look at the stimulus for about less than like 8 seconds, 9 seconds or so on average, but they are relatively slow to habituate compared to the first subgroup. The last one is long lookers, so they look pretty long, about 15 seconds and early on, especially early on in those trials, but they tend to, it seems like they're finishing up early, meaning they habituate relatively faster. Multimodal takes a little longer to get used to, it looks like. We have one short looker cluster that's talking about starting around 10 to 11 seconds to look in the very first trial. And there are two long lookers, one faster to habituate where they end pretty much around 9 to 10 trials, and the other one slow to habituate, they tend to go up to 20 trials a lot. So we did some association studies where we looked into demographic variables, including sex and education. I didn't show here that was not associated. Habituated, yes or no, risk high versus low, and I also compare the features from the two portions of the task, the experimental portion of the number of trials until habituation, and average looking time of first and last trials, because I guess that in literature it's really important to see how fast they grasp the information from the first 3 trials and how they retain that type of pattern of learning in the last 3 trials, and also the features that we got from the test portion as well. So this is unimodal, and that's the plot that you saw in the previous slide, and I put that there as a reference here. Some noticeable significant differences happen in the experimental portion because that is the data that we use for clustering. It seems like cluster 1 that we named short lookers, fast to habituate, tend to spend a lot less time in the first and the last 3 trials here compared to the other 2 subtypes. And their risk here, which is the familiar risk of ADHD, is the lowest between the subtype 1 and 2, especially compared to subtype 3, even if it was not statistically significant, kind of indicating that the short lookers have the lower risk of ADHD later on, or at least in the context of familiar ADHD risk compared to the long lookers. Same table, but multimodal. stimulus here. You notice also, again, that the lower numbers of looking time, lower values of looking time in the subtype 1 because they are short lookers compared to the 2 other long looker clusters. And the cluster 2, noticeably, is the one with the 100% habituated group, meaning that even though they start kind of long looking, they tend to grasp the concept pretty fast, and then they achieve the habituation. The last is the logistic regression model, modeling the association between either the demographic variables or the features of the unimodal or multimodal tasks with the familiar risk of ADHD. We didn't really have a lot of significant results here, but noticeably, when you have more time in the first 3 trials of experimental portion, you have a higher chance of having the familiar ADHD risk, specifically in the multimodal task. So this is definitely something that we didn't plan on doing on this grant proposal, but it was a very important piece of work because we think that this has to be studied more as an early indicator of ADHD symptoms, and potentially as they are collecting data for later childhood of the same infants, we can in fact you make a predictive model of their own ADHD risk instead of the familiar-based ADHD risk. But the key takeaway here is that long looker type it has a higher chance of ADHD risk compared to the short lookers, and so reversely, that could be a sign for the efficiency of learning, and therefore has to be sought out as a good thing for their cognitive ability and learning ability later on. I know we're going to save the Q&A time in the end. Do we have any questions before we move to the next talk? All right. Last presentation, we have Dr. Melissa Dvorsky. Here you go.
All right. Thank you all. Excited to be here and be part of this presentation today. We're aging up a good bit from infants. I'm going to talk about a middle school study using an app to really target organization and time management skills. Also, I'm an assistant professor of pediatrics and psychiatry at Children's National and George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I have funding from the NIMH and a private foundation that funds this work that I'm going to be sharing about today. I have other projects that are funded through the U.S. Department of Education. Sorry, I will speak closer to this. It sounds like there's a gap. All right, so the projects that we do with adolescents with ADHD occur in schools for a few different reasons. And here's a picture of some of our team doing a school training for our organizational skills intervention. And schools are really important context for reaching adolescents, but really all youth, and particularly youth that would historically be underrepresented in treatments and experience barriers to accessing mental health treatments, either through psychiatry, psychology. And so we've teamed up in some of our work to partner with school counselors, school psychologists, school social workers, to intervene with students that they already know and have relationships with, and we're trying to really reduce the stigma around ADHD, especially in this environment, and reach those who otherwise might not get access and who have historically been underrepresented, especially in our research in ADHD. Okay, we talked a bit about ADHD and how it presents in childhood. I wanted to share just a couple of things relevant specifically to adolescents. And when you think about trying to remember back to middle school, or if you have kids in middle school, or you know a middle schooler, think about that context of moving between multiple classes and kind of how you adapt to different teachers' needs and demands. Some classrooms that might be more structured, those others might be less structured, how homework is assigned, how information about homework is communicated to a student. Maybe it's written on the board, maybe it is just shown online, or it's just said verbally, tomorrow you need to turn this in. Kids are getting information in all different ways, and kids with ADHD can sometimes struggle or often struggle with consolidating that information. And then on top of that, you're competing with other distractors in the environment. Like if I write down my homework that I have in the last 5 minutes of class, then I'll know what I need to do when I get to study hall or after school. But if I don't write down my homework in the last 5 minutes of class, then I get to go out to the hallway sooner and see my friends at their locker, and that's more rewarding than a kid with ADHD is making those kind of immediate, in-the-moment decisions. They might choose what's more reinforcing to them. So we're competing with a lot of distractors when trying to get kids to practice organization, time management skills that we might teach them. How do we get them to do it in the moment, in the school day, at home, with friends, at any point? So we have evidence-based interventions. Really, there's a pretty strong evidence base for organization, time management skills interventions in adolescents. So this is sort of one of the primary interventions that it's a psychosocial intervention that's been developed for this age group. And some of the key things to note about how these interventions work is that you're teaching a compensatory skill like organizing your book bag or using a planner to remember tasks. And then you have to have frequent practice of these skills, and it's important that this be in naturalistic settings as close to the point of performance as possible, which means when and where those behaviors should happen. Trying to get youth to practice in those settings, and then engaging adults in some form of contingency management, so providing positive reinforcement for whenever you do those behaviors, and trying to make that again, be as immediate to when that behavior happens. So when we implement organization time management skills, even in schools where we're doing the program at school where they're assigned homework, or maybe even during their study hall, we're doing this intervention, we're trying to be in the moment and immediate, but yet there's still all those like micro moments throughout one's day where these behaviors are actually happening. So we can change so much by seeing them in the school versus in a clinic setting, or once a week versus a couple times a week, or a few times if we're able to do it in the school setting. However, we did some analyses from our traditional school-based intervention of the homework organization planning skills intervention. We looked at engagement. Here, this graph is plotting homework recording over the course of weeks of the intervention. And what we saw, even though there were really significant main effects in improving homework recording over the intervention, when we did growth mixture modeling to examine different individual trajectories, we found there are kind of two different types of clusters of responders. We had these early adopters that started recording their homework when the intervention started, and then they really kind of continued to grow and increase in how many different assignments they were tracking. And then we have these kind of like slow adopters who really never took on. So they tried it a little bit. They recorded maybe about 60% of their assignments initially, but then it kind of drops off. And we saw similar or even greater amounts of non-responders when we looked at other outcomes like practicing organization skills, practicing time management skills, or study skills. So I would argue that 20 to 40% that's in that kind of not really using the skills group is a really important group to target. We're not really reaching them with our status quo behavioral interventions. And so that is what brought us to the digital solution that I'm going to talk about today, which is really focused on kind of trying to provide more in-the-moment feedback and giving students an opportunity to receive more social support by having views that adults can see. So teachers, parents, and counselors can see how the student's doing and give live feedback, but also the students getting immediate feedback. So when they add a task into their digital calendar, they get a celebration, and they get coins that they're earning, and they get those visuals that can be really reinforcing in that moment. They can also see more live about their progress, their daily goals, what they're trying to track, and their progress towards their rewards. So that way, they're a bit more centered into the intervention itself through the digital platform. So just a little bit about what the intervention looks like to help in talking through how we use the technology with it. So the program itself has 16 sessions. It happens over the course of about 10 weeks. We meet with students, our counselors in schools meet with students about twice a week for really brief check-in sessions. So these are 15, 20 minutes where they're focused on talking about a skill in one of these different modules, either homework recording, like that graph I showed earlier, or perhaps like an organization strategy. Organization isn't just book bag and binders like in the graphic here. It's also digital organization and how do they track drafts of assignments that they're working on, getting assignments done, turned in, planning ahead for bigger projects, they're studying in advance for tests, as well as a sort of a self-regulation or self-management module where they start taking on some of their own tracking themselves. So they meet one-on-one with the students, they teach these skills, then they set goals around how they're gonna practice the skill, and then in theory, the student leaves that session and then they go about their school day implementing that skill perfectly, but not really. And so what we, historically, that would be it. That would be where it left off with the program. Now the students have a digital platform that they can use on any of their school devices or their personal device that they take with them, and they practice the skills themselves in the app, and they track their progress in the app. I'm saying app, but it's actually a web-based platform, and we designed it that way so that way it could be accessible across the different school districts and the changing school policies about personal cell phone use. So this allows us to have it be accessible, whether the school uses Google Chromebooks, whether they have iPads, whether a student's using it on their personal phone. And we work with them to kind of bookmark it so it functions as an app for them on their homepage of their devices. All right, so here's a little bit about the study that we're doing. This is funded with an NIH K23 award that we have 3 different phases. We've completed the first 2 phases, which were really focused on a lot of discovery and designing the app, the features, the design, with students, with parents, with educators, really adopting a community participatory research design where we had folks really co-developing this with us. Even the name Adam came up with by one of our middle school students. And so that has been a really important part of this and wanting this technology to be something that was adopted by them, especially with an increase in different platforms that are used in schools, trying to think about the key features that would be most important to these youth. Then we did an open trial where everybody received the Adam app plus the original HOPS intervention. And now we are nearly done with the randomized trial where we randomized students to receive either the HOPS intervention alone or the HOPS intervention with this Adam augmentation. So either using paper and pencil procedures as previously done or doing everything through the online Adam platform. And today I'm going to be presenting about 75% of our data is complete from our randomized trial. So this is very hot off the presses and we're not in press yet. Very preliminary data, but very exciting results that we have so far. So the Adam features that we developed were really informed by the Combe model of behavior change, which emphasizes targeting capability, opportunities, and motivation to change a behavior. And this model is not specific to ADHD, but we kind of adapted this framework and applied it to ADHD. So here, kind of drawing some parallels in ways that the capability is targeted in our ADAM platform, we're trying to really try to reducing the forgetfulness and inattentiveness and the working memory load for individuals with ADHD. By motivation, we're really trying to increase the immediacy of rewards and making them more reinforcing, because we know that that can be impaired in individuals with ADHD. And with opportunity, what we're really targeting is providing more opportunities for those skills to be practiced and providing in the moment social support by sending out sort of updates to the parents, the teachers, and counselors so they can see how the student's doing and be nudged to provide that positive reinforcement. So our end goal is to hopefully increase skill utilization, so things like homework performance, organization, time management. But we also then hope that over time, this leads to more sustained skill use after the program ends, not just during the program, but 6 months later, as well as reduced symptom severity and impairment related to ADHD, which can be anything from academic engagement and motivation, grades, teacher-rated performance in the classroom. And I'm going to be sharing today the data on the right here that is our pilot feasibility data. And again, this is roughly 75% of our samples collected so far. It represents somewhat diverse sample. These are schools. There's actually two private schools and a handful of public schools where these students came from. A good portion of them had IEPs or 504 plans, so they were identified by the school as receiving services or accommodations, and about a quarter of them were taking medication for ADHD. And again, these are all students in grades 6 to 8. And some of the findings, just to highlight a few from our initial design with students, these are some of the priority areas, and we're working on summarizing these data in a sort of qualitative paper now to talk about sort of the priorities for our students, the priorities for parents and school mental health providers in using technology in schools. So they're really emphasize the importance of personalization, making it streamlined, and also engaging views, providing in-the-moment prompts for weak executive functioning, so more automated reminders, having opportunities for parents to get reminded to remind, and making sure that there's notifications not just of when something's not going wrong, when an assignment hasn't been turned in, or when a task hasn't been marked as complete, but also that they're getting the notifications about the positive behaviors, because we know individuals with ADHD tend to get a lot more negative feedback in their environment all day, every day, than they do positive feedback. So trying to work on increasing that as well. Okay, so then we refined the intervention or the application, and here's some of our updated views of what the platform looks like. I have these little GIFs, which hopefully work. It can show some of the features. There's these digital checklists that the students set up with their counselor. They have a task list they can view in a few different ways. This is sort of showing a swim lanes version of it, where they can view their tasks in different stages that they're in, similar to like a Trello app. They also have a calendar view of their tasks, where it's really meant to be formatted like a Google Calendar, because our end goal is not that the students use ADAM forever. We want them learning to use any calendar, like an Outlook calendar or Google Calendar that we all rely on today, but making it reinforcing the habit of it and the practice of it throughout adolescence. Then they have these visual rewards where we added sort of a progress bar and the opportunity to either pick from a bank of rewards and visuals, as well as create your own. And more recently, we created these skill videos where, I don't think it's going to load, where a lot of our actual high school students and undergraduate students created these animated skill videos that kind of talk about a storyline related to organization or time management or conflict with a parent or a teacher, and how they handle that. And those aren't really watched in sessions with a counselor as part of the intervention. They're really just supplemental in the app, and we're looking at how do students engage with them. So in the different versions of ADAM across the few years, we've had increases in our SUS ratings, which you can see here across parents, adolescents, and clinicians or school counselors. All right, and I'm going to move into talking about our randomized trial and what we have so far. So this is a pilot feasibility trial, so we're really focused on will people use the program? Is using the program in a digital way versus the old-fashioned paper way just as feasible or scalable for schools? Do students respond equally as well? And so we're really not powered to detect great group differences here, and what I'm going to present next is some simple mean comparisons from pre to post across the two groups. Again, HOPS is the acronym for the paper traditional version, and ADAM is the name of the intervention with the digital augmentation. So we looked at parent and teacher ratings of organization problems. So this is a total organization problems rated from 1 to 4. The teacher ratings showed no differences across the two groups, so they both responded similarly from pre to post. Here I'm showing the parent-rated organization problems, and you can see they both do go down in the HOPS group and the ADAM group, but they go down slightly more in that technology-enhanced group with a pretty near moderate effect size. Then we looked at teacher-rated homework completion, and this is a percentage here. So this is the percentage of assignments that were rated by teachers as being completed at baseline to post, and we saw really positive that we saw improvements here in both groups. This is what we would hope for. We also look at grades and test performance. Those are harder things to change historically, even in our most intense interventions targeting organizational skills, because there's a lot that goes into grades. But we're really proud of this, that the program and both groups really are working towards improving the number of assignments completed and reducing the number of missing assignments that students have. And here we have a really pretty large effect between those that were using the technology version versus the HOPS version. Okay, so beyond parent and teacher outcomes, we also really care about the students and what they think about how they're doing. So one area that we examined was students' engagement in school, how they feel, what their self-efficacy is and their motivation with their academics. So here we saw much greater levels of academic motivation improving from baseline to post-intervention, especially in the HOPS and ADAM group with small to moderate effect sizes. And here we're looking at academic efficacy. So this is sort of how well do you think you're doing in school? And there are various sort of facets of this that factor in, including school connectedness, how you're getting along with your teacher, how effective you feel, how much you're participating in class. And we saw improvements from pre to post with both. Here the formatting just changed, but we saw slightly greater growth in the ADAM group. These colors swapped there. Okay, so overall, we found across many outcomes, we saw improvements in both groups. Depending on the outcome, we saw a bit larger in the technology-enhanced group. Although for some things like teacher-rated organization, we didn't, though the parents noticed more of the differences at home if they were using the app. And then in looking at sort of uptake and engagement in the app, so far we've seen students are engaging in using the program on average about twice a day. And this is number of weekdays for both the parent and the student combined. So the number of days that they examine the intervention on average across the 16 number of school days that they use the program during the intervention. across the 16 sessions. And then the average length of time that they spent in the app is actually pretty short. So there's a home page when they first log in, and they quickly can go to the different things that they need. And generally what we're finding is that people quickly add their assignment, or maybe they add a couple assignments, but they tend to not spend a lot of time in the app after that, which is fine, but it's not necessarily our goal either. There's a lot of variability here that we want to tease apart, because sometimes they're using the app in the 15-minute session, and so the app is up the whole time, and so there's some data in here that's maybe even reflecting a longer use, if that's what that's for. Okay, let me skip ahead to the rest of our results. So here we're looking at the usability ratings across various features of the app from the school clinicians, the students, and the parents. And overall, these were really quite high across the board. Then when we talked to school counselors and asked them to do ratings about the program, here we are just summarizing findings from those in the ADAM enhanced version, so the technology version, that the school providers are rating it pretty high, that they would use the program again, that they find it feasible, and that they think that other students could benefit from the tool, and they would recommend it to other schools. All right, so here, let's see. Yeah, here's where we are now and where we're going next. So we are piloting or finishing our pilot for the randomized control trial now. We have our last cohort is being collected, finishing the intervention this semester as we speak, which is really exciting. And we have some preliminary data that I shared today that shows some positive improvements, many things that improved in both groups, some things that improved more so in the student group who received the technology enhanced version, especially when it came to the parent-rated organization and the teacher assignment completion rates for the students. So those we're most excited about for those that got the ADAM version. We are continuing to sort of develop the application with more feedback from students and families. We are working towards adding more sort of personalized, adaptive, in-the-moment reminders. So currently, our reminders function just living in the application itself. So you have to kind of click when you have one and then view it there. And we hope to be moved towards being able to push those out to students, have them through either pop-up notifications or through texting. There's been a lot of change in school policies around cell phone use, especially this school year. So that's something we've had to sort of shift gears on and rethink what is going to be the best way to try that. And our sort of immediate next steps are we're excited to really examine this in a much larger trial with more schools and more students using the program, so we can really look at sort of what are driving mechanisms and how are we improving students' academic outcomes and their overall psychosocial functioning, and as well as examine in a hybrid effectiveness implementation trial where we can look at kind of in what ways does the intervention work best, because we're getting feedback from counselors that they'd like to use it with students without ADHD, that they might enjoy using it with students in a small group setting, and so sort of examining in what different implementation approaches could this be optimized in as well. And we have a website here, so if you'd like to learn more about the program or the things that we're doing, you can find more there. It's just theadamprogram.com. And I do want to take a moment and thank some of my fabulous mentors and advisors from my Key 23 advisory team, our funders, the families, the youth, the schools that partner with us. This research wouldn't be possible without our collaborations in the community. And my fabulous research coordinators and research assistants and volunteers that work with us in our lab. Nothing would be possible without them as well. And yeah, thank you. Excited for our discussion next. Are there any immediate questions? Or are we going to just do a group to do? Yeah.
Is there a way that you incorporate, thank you, the positive reinforcement or feedback in general in the app that would motivate them to do better? Or are you planning on?
Yeah, that's a really great point. So we don't have any intentional features, I will say, the moment that try to get at peer positive reinforcement. I am curious if when we implement the program in small groups, one approach could be having teens like pair off with each other, check each other, and then provide those opportunities for giving positive feedback with an adult that's kind of circulated around the group rather than in a one-on-one adult to student. Our app developers created a leaderboard in the app that we didn't ask for it, but they sort of just made it. And some students told us they liked it. Some people really didn't like it. And so that's something that we could eventually look at to see do folks feel that it's a positive reinforcer and kind of what it is that about some individuals feeling that causes pressure or anxiety or stress, and then how it's motivating for some and others, and what perhaps predicts that.
Right, to add a little bit to that, surprisingly peer feedback is more effective than teacher or other authoritative figures. And one of the ways that could alleviate that pressure off of the students is to make those comments anonymous. There were like compliments coming from, oh, my friend Traci, oh, okay, she likes me, versus somebody else, maybe I feel like I have to give back some kind of compliment to you, or I gotta live up to your expectations, something like that. But if it's anonymous, I think it's more pure encouragement rather than, the pressure accompanied compliment.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think that seems like something that would require also like a moderator in some way to make sure the comments were appropriate. But that does seem valuable for getting students to do that, and perhaps they could earn like coins or be reinforced for reinforcing a peer. Yeah.
All right, so that's all 3 presentations that we prepare for the symposium. We're gonna open up and answer any questions you have for any of us. Do you have a question?
Thank you so much, all 3 of you. Each presentation was really excellent. Dr. Kennedy, I have a question for you. I was wondering how I noticed that you collect GPS data as well, and I was wondering if you had given any thought as to how that might be utilized as maybe acting as a proxy for the parent context reporting. Maybe you could see if kids are geographically at school versus at home.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we haven't used it yet, right? Part of our thought is, can we use it as a proxy for or a more direct, helpful indicator within the model of context? Are they at school versus at home? I think some of the technical issues we're running up against are at what frequency the data are going to get sent, and how real time we're able to use that. So is that even going to be helpful? It certainly wouldn't be able to tell us though, are they at recess versus sitting in their classroom? And I think that's the point where we're really getting to it. How helpful is this going to be for the context? We're also concerned about the privacy issues, no matter how much our technical experts try to explain that it gets obfuscated, and we're not getting those, we're not recording those raw GPS identifiable locations. I think I'm a little concerned that families won't want to participate or have that. So the way we're going to approach it in this next phase is to basically make it optional so parents can opt out of it. So it's not necessarily going to be, required in our models, but if we get some of it, like maybe see how it can be helpful. So I think my short answer to all that is like, I don't know. But hopefully we can see if there's any like incremental utility of it.
So GPS, it usually collects in a study every 5 minutes or so. So it's pretty granular considering, but privacy issue for sure. For school activities, it may be kind of hard to distinguish between the recess or bathroom or classroom because it may be accounted as like a one location. I was going to ask you, is there a way we can get the students' schedule? Then we would expect that they're supposed to be sitting because they're in math class, but if they're moving around, their accelerometer goes off, then that means it's just something wrong.
Yeah, that's something we've talked about too, and we might do that. I'm just thinking about my 6-year-old who their schedule seems to change every day. I don't know if that's just his classroom, but yeah, I think at least as a baseline or a proxy, that's something we might do in this next phase. Great suggestion.
So this question, this question's a little bit broad, but maybe it'll be an interesting discussion. So admittedly, I don't know a lot about ADHD, especially when it comes to the current standards for medication management and what is encouraged or not encouraged with children. But I'm a little bit interested to hear how, and maybe a little less so for infants for this question, but how medication might come into play with some of these technologies. I imagine with your platform, are you finding that it goes really well hand in hand with the medication, or is it actually helping to medicate children less because they're able to use a platform? And when I think about your tool, right, do you think we could use this as a way to identify when, maybe medication isn't working as effectively as it should, or could it help identify when children are having the most hyperactivity so we can provide them extra therapies for those moments so we could do less medication? I'm just curious, I guess, what maybe the goals might be in the field for any of this.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think at the broadest level, our goal is to have this tool be able to give an objective measure of how effective medication is, and especially when starting new medication or switching medications, because we know that medication is effective, but those reports can be subjective, and it can take a long time to sort of calibrate and get more of those teacher reports. And so basically complementing or replacing those more subjective reports. As far as sort of moments in their life or moments in the day when maybe they need that extra support, I think it's a possibility. There's some recent work, though, I think showing that hyperactivity as a symptom itself might actually indicate within a child, periods when they're actually focusing better. And so having fidget spinners is a big trend right now. And I think we have to know better first, within a child, moments when their hyperactivity spikes, are those necessarily times when we need more support or medication, or what might that be signaling? So I guess from the psychology perspective, I'm more interested in identifying those first so then we can study them better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's 2 thoughts. One, so my Adam right now, we're testing in middle schools. But there is a good amount of research that shows that over the course of high school, adolescents who were taking medication with ADHD, 90% of them stop in high school at some point. So there's this huge drop-off that happens at that later of adolescence. And I think, as a psychologist speaking, I think what I see in the families that we work with is that it's sort of a combination of parents saying, I don't know, is it still working? Do you want to? And then the teen saying, I don't know, and then they just stop taking it. So whether tools could be used to help like increase their awareness on days that they remember to take it or days that they don't take it, and perhaps starting in early high school or middle school with that. In our sample in middle schools that's recruited from a school sample, because it's not a clinic-based sample, and these are really diverse schools in Washington, D.C., that in these communities, medication is, there are a lot of families that just are not interested, and ADHD itself is pretty stigmatized. So our goal isn't necessarily to sort of increase their likeliness to take medication, but we're more focused on the organizational, foundational skills. But through that, I think we're engaging them in their care and kind of can build relationships from there to better be able to talk with them about the approaches if that was appropriate.
But also, I would bet, like in your ADAM program combined with the HOPS, like if a child was on medication or a teen was on medication, you know, the whole point of these psychosocial treatments is to build the skills and habits, yet, you know, maybe the medication would help them attend more in like the skill sessions, and then that would lead to sort of better execution and building of the habits. So I wonder if there is like synergy there at all. The statistician says to model it, yeah.
Yeah. I think the tricky thing is, and maybe we need to kind of combine methods, because I think the tricky thing is that the students that take medication, it's for both, like sometimes they're taking the medication so their ADHD is more managed, other times they're taking medication because they have a more severe form of ADHD, and just because they, like when we measure taking medication, that's at each time point of our assessment that we ask, are they currently taking, but not did you take today? And so what they get out of every given session could depend on whether they did, hey, did you take your medication today? So that hasn't been asked. And maybe, looking more finer grain to see the impacts on the like engagement when the skills are introduced and their ability to practice it alone. Oh, I have a question for you while I'm holding the mic, I guess. Have you thought about summer treatment programs or more intense environments where you could sort of measure recreation and academic environments over the course of a day, and there are a lot of like sort of ecological validity concerns that don't necessarily map onto that, but if that's an alternative to the parent label.
That's such a great question. Yeah, so for those of you unfamiliar, one of the big things in ADHD treatment are these summer treatment programs. So it's like send your kid to day camp, and they're going to be getting all of the skills training, and we're also going to do research in those like pretty controlled environments. Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be awesome to do. I sort of, in designing this study, we were thinking about the types of activities they'd be doing in a summer treatment program and not necessarily replicating that in the lab, but that's sort of the idea of our lab-based days on and off medication, because then we still need them to wear it in the real world where we're not controlling things, to like collect more of that real world data and see if we can classify those days in the real world. So maybe we should have been doing this in a summer treatment program, but that's a really good idea, maybe for next steps.
Right. On the other hand, I guess a lot of summer treatment programs playing sports and doing different activities that maybe a kid with ADHD is, not all of those kids would be doing that on their normal day-to-day basis. So
yeah, do they do much of like sitting down and having to sit quietly and like focus?
there's usually like a classroom
Yeah,
component for a portion of the day,
right.
but small.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a cool piece to combine for sure. It's a good idea. Thanks. Other questions? We have just a couple minutes left.
I'll ask another question then.
This actually might be more for Dr. Diaz, but kind of just anyone. So I think your work really lends to like maybe early diagnosis and early intervention. And again, as someone who knows not a lot about ADHD, I guess how big of a problem is trying to find these kids sooner so that they can be, treated or provided therapies. And so I just think your work lends really well to that, and how might digital health help to find these kids sooner? Yeah.
That's a great question. I don't know if I can answer that, but I'll try. The focus of my presentation today is to use the screen type of exposure to get the diagnosis earlier, or indicators, because it's kind of tricky, because habituation is one of the indicators, but you don't know if they're just not feeling it that day, or they just tend to be that kind of person, but it's nothing to do with their ADHD later on or not. I think I may be able to link the digital interventions that you saw in other presenters for kids of a younger age, although it should be in a different form, because they're not going to be able to complete a task or anything on a smart devices. Potentially, there are other things that they look into. For example, this same investigator is interested in early indicators of ADHD in infancy, including the anticipation of an exposure. So if there's going to be a blinking exposure coming from left to right, then left to right for a while, then you learn, and then while you're looking left, you know that the next light is going to come right, then it's going to come to the left. So they would change to that direction before that exposure happens. So something like that, I think, if you can come up with games or like app-based games that could actually enhance their learning skills, I think that would be important. Another thing is the joint gaze between parent and kids. So that the same investigator doing slightly different experimentation, where they have a bunch of toys on a table, and then they're just having a free play, right? Mom or dad and the baby. And they're measuring how many times and what duration of each time they're looking at the same toy together. And they're talking about how joint gaze can be a good indicator of their relationship, and therefore can be a protective factor, regardless of the familiar risk of ADHD, on their the interaction with the caregivers. So something like that, less of a digital intervention, but once you notice that kind of a risk factor, we may be able to intervene on that earlier on.
And yeah, I think just from the psychologist's perspective, like in the autism spectrum disorder world, we have this huge push towards early intervention, and we have extremely good early interventions and know now how important that is. We don't really have that in the ADHD literature, and I think that's because it doesn't get diagnosed till later. So if we can at least have this first step, then I think we can determine, using technology or otherwise, like what types of early interventions could there be? Does that have any sort of impact? And then I think about the parents too. Like by the time you get to a diagnosis, when the kid is 8 or older, it takes a big, it's a heavy lift to like make that shift from my kid is just not listening and whatever bad things to, okay, this is brain-based, this is ADHD, let me shift my thinking. So even the parents' understanding, I think we could find would have a big effect if we could get at that earlier. So yeah, optimistic for the next steps for the future.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So we're at time, and so I want to wrap up, but I think we're obviously happy to answer any other individual questions, and thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate your time and attention for these ADHD talks, and yeah, hope to see you around. So thank you so much.